Second part of cognitivism is language and cognition, and also cognitive perceptual processes. So now let's discuss language and cognition first. Vygotsky is a Russian psychologist who believed that language was one of the most important psychological tools that affects children's cognitive development. So he laid down great emphasis on language as the most important tool which really affects children's cognitive process. How? Firstly, language is an essential factor of communication that has to do with the social aspect. And second, children begin to use egocentric or private speech to control their own thinking. So children, they tend to speak to themselves. They get engaged in a private speech to control their own thinking and try to work on what needs to be said, what needs not to be said. So that is why language has a very crucial role in the understanding of cognition. The relationship between language and cognition as interactive process remain unresolved. Researchers have been working very hard on addressing the questions, the key questions which have been raised in terms of looking at language and cognition, that whether they should be looked at together or these are two different domains, two different phenomena which should be looked into separately from each other. Now there are questions such as, what is the role of language and cognition in thinking? Is language just a communication device, or is it fundamental in developing thoughts? What knowledge responsible to explain brain function for language, cognition, and etc.? Researchers have been conducted on these questions or getting answers to these questions, but majority of them are still remain unanswered because there are no fixed or hard and fast rules in terms of looking at these two domains and providing key answers to these questions. According to Perlowski and Sky, a latest research in terms of the understanding of language and mind, they believe that we assume that mind is a part of brain function, and we tentatively define the mind as a combination of three main cognitive factors, which are perception, memory, and consciousness. Language is created by mind, yet once uttered, words return to the mind where they are understood. The cycle from the mind to language and then from the language to mind is recursive. In that, the language produced by mind comes back to the mind once again. This recursiveness is important when considering the relationship between language and mind. So, what is the factor responsible for understanding the language, which is processed in the mind and then expressed, and that expression again comes back to the mind from where it is actually originated? This recursiveness is crucial as far as if one has to understand the relationship between language and mind. Understanding of cognitive perceptual processes enable to analyze the mental processes involved. Now we are looking at the perceptual cognitive processes. Perception in this particular context is taken to be as a process of forming judgment, process of developing assumptions. This process serves the attainment of a mental representation of an object, how that object is perceived, how you assume in terms of the understanding of that particular object. It is argued that perceptual processes are an essential part of the basis of cognitive ability. Yes, it completely looks into the way people perceive, and on the basis of perception, they develop their understanding. So that is why it is considered as a complete cognitive ability. mental processes are involved. Cognition is involved in terms of developing a complete process. Key concepts of the basis of which perceptual processes are developed are mentioned here. Number one is schema. Schema is basically an internal knowledge structure. It may be combined, extended, or altered to accommodate new information, although there is already an information available in the form of new and in the form of old and new information. Three-stage information processing model. It has sensory register, short-term memory, long-term memory, and retrieval. Now, sensory register receives input from senses which last for less than a second to 4 seconds and thus disappears through decay or replacement. Much of the information never reaches short-term memory, but all information is monitored at some level and acted upon if necessary. Short-term memory. Sensory input that is important to interesting is transferred from the sensory register to short-term memory, and it can be retained here for up to 20 seconds or more if rehearsed repeatedly. Long-term memory and storage stores information from short-term memory for long-term use. Meaningful effects. Meaningful information is easier to learn and remember. If a learner links relatively meaningless information with prior schema, it will be easier to retain. Serial position effects. It is easier to remember items from the beginning or end of a list rather than those in the middle of the list until and unless that item is distinctly different. Practice effect. Practicing or rehearsing improves retention, especially when it is distributed practice. Transfer effect. The effects of prior learning on learning new tasks or material. Interference effects refer to the occurrence when prior learning interferes with the learning of new material. Organization effects. When a learner categorizes input, such as any list, grocery list, it is easier to remember. Level of processing effect. The more deeply a word is processed, the easier it will be to remember. State-dependent effects. If learning takes place within a certain context, it will be easier to remember within that context rather than in a new context. Mnemonic effects are the strategies used by learners to organize relatively meaningless input into more meaningful images or cementing context. And last but not the least is advanced organizers, which refers to advanced organizers prepare the learner for the material they are about to learn. They are not simply outlines of the material, but are materials that will enable the learner to make sense out of the learning. To conclude, cognitivism is the psychology of learning which emphasizes human cognition or intelligence as a special endowment enabling men to form hypotheses and develop intellectually. And perceptual processes enable us to perceive reality based on cognitive processes.